Perfect, right. Let's get going. We've got a lot to go through today. Just the usual housekeeping today. This session will be recorded. Please do keep your cameras off, keep yourself on mute, or you will be muted. If you've got any questions, feel free to populate the chat box as we go, and if we've got time, we'll address them. Or if not, we hopefully will have some time at the end for some questions as well. So just throw them in the chat box and we'll try and get them as we go. First of all, this is going to be the last time I say this year, but Happy New Year to you all. It's on behalf of the team and everybody at Burness Paul, we wish you every best fortune for 2023, and we look forward to working with you. So on to today, we have got three speakers today. Myself, Caroline Stevenson, I am a partner and head up the Financial Services Regulatory team at Burness Paul, and I'm joined today by Jamie Gray, who is a fellow partner, and Chris Woodfine, who is senior associate. So a focus of our last Horizon Scan session, which I think was in August last year, was the new future for financial services in the UK and the developments of many initiatives in the industry and the movement towards that. And so we can safely say that since then, there's been a plethora of developments. So there's plenty to talk about today. However, there is one development that we were expecting that hasn't landed as planned, and that's the FCA's regulatory initiatives grid. Now, as you may know, the FCA had committed to publish a regulatory initiatives grid twice a year, and we were expecting the most recent one to be published last November, but unfortunately this did not happen. And if you're familiar with the initiatives grid, you'll know that it sort of sets out their roadmap on the things that they're looking to achieve over the next 6 months. So despite that gap, you'll see that throughout today's presentation, we've tried to compile everything we know to date based on previous initiatives grid and everything else. And where there's a bit of uncertainty, we've tried to also highlight that. So on to today's presentation and what we do know. Well, if you cast your mind back to our August update, you'll remember that we discussed the progress of the Financial Services and Markets Bill. And that's the pioneering piece of legislation which is setting or laying the foundations for the new regulatory framework in the UK. And the good news is that bill has just had its second reading in the House of Lords last week on the 10th. And so the next part of the journey is for the bill to head into the committee stage. And the first date of this will be on the 25th of January. This progress means that the bill is nearing the end of its parliamentary journey, with only a few stages left before it's looked to obtain royal assent. And since we last spoke, there's only been some minor amendments to the bill, including the rejection of the government's proposed call-in powers, which would have provided HM Treasury with a public interest intervention power in respect of the regulators. That one has been scrubbed. And the second significant change is that the government has decided against including provisions in the Financial Services Markets Bill relating to refusals by payment services providers to provide payment services for reasons connected with freedom of expression. There was a PayPal case that they were looking at in respect to this, and it's quite interesting if you looked at it. But effectively, they looked at this case study and decided that the legislative framework as drafted was sufficient. But saying that, I will caveat by saying that there are some forthcoming changes in the payments, and we'll look at some of that later in the presentation. So no real massive developments to the bill over the last 6 months since we last spoke. So what else is new? Well, on the 9th of December, the industry was hit with an early Christmas present taking the form of the Edinburgh reforms. I'm just checking, has our screen, I think the slides have come back on, have they? Hopefully Jake's is still squirreling away in the background, hitting the next one, but we're headed on to the Edinburgh reforms next. And so we got this early Christmas present, which was this package of reforms. And a lot of people are wondering why they're called the Edinburgh reforms. Well, that is simply because the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced the package of reforms while he was at an industry roundtable in Edinburgh. So we have the Edinburgh reforms. And the Chancellor, having highlighted that the financial sector was one of the UK's 5 key growth sectors, these reforms represent one of the it's a most significant package of changes the industry has seen in recent times. And the reason behind this is to try and deliver growth and increase international competitiveness for the UK financial services. So the series of reforms seeks to set the future regulatory framework for 2023 and beyond. And the government will seek to deliver a smarter regulatory framework by making use of what they are calling Brexit freedoms. So within the reforms, there are 30 policy initiatives, and these are designed to implement the outcomes of the future regulatory framework review, and they will revoke and replace the retained EU law with UK laws, which will govern financial services. And this is allowing the regulators and HM Treasury within the UK to have more control over the framework of financial services. So the good news is, or maybe the bad news is, we're not going to talk about all 30 initiatives today, but we'll cover some of them. So as we go on, you'll see that as before, our presentation today will show the plans we already know about, which are going to help shape the sector for the new year, the next year. But given the diverse audience we were expecting today, we've tried to cover a really broad range of developments, and some of that might not be relevant for you and your particular firm. But despite this, it should still be of interest, because by the end of the session, you should get an overall understanding of the direction of travel for other financial services firms in light of the changes. As usual, throughout the presentation, we'll be looking at the year ahead broken down by quarter. And so we'll give you a reminder of the key dates within that quarter, and we'll pick out one or two of the topics within that quarter to discuss in a bit more detail. As usual, we haven't had the space in the slides nor the time in this hour-long presentation to go over absolutely everything we're expecting in that quarter. So the caveat is, make sure you continue to do your own horizon scan and check your own horizon scan pad to make sure that there's nothing missed off that's relevant to you and your firm. One thing I was going to say is, when you look at the quarters, when we get to that point, if you look at the items that are detailed in red, these are the ones that directly emanate from the Edinburgh reform, so just bear that in mind. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Jamie, who's going to give you our first update on the Consumer Duty.
Thanks, Caroline, and hello, everyone. Yes, here we have the Consumer Duty, and the Consumer Duty is really the elephant in the room in the context of all the other topics we're discussing today, because it bucks the trend that we're seeing towards targeted lightening of regulation. And you know, many of us are familiar with it. It's a topic that we covered as part of the previous horizon scanning session, and it's not part of the Edinburgh reforms, but it is driving a fundamental shift in the industry, and there are still a few milestones ahead, so I'm sure it will crop up again. But just as a quick recap before we get into the quarterly consultation, it's a very significant package of rules and guidance, and it sets higher expectations for the standard of care that financial services firms are expected to give to consumers in retail financial markets. And the overarching principle that it all hinges around is that firms must act to deliver good outcomes for retail clients. And then beneath that, you have three cross-cutting rules: act in good faith, avoid causing foreseeable harm, and enable and support customers to pursue their financial objectives. These are, you know, quite novel duties and rules that apply to firms. And then there are four prescribed outcomes that the rules are designed to achieve, which are to require firms to ensure consumers receive communications they can understand, products and services meet their needs and offer fair value. And that's a topic that's come up recently with the FCA's Inside FCA podcast that was issued on the 6th of January. So that's worth a listen. And also to make sure that consumers get the support they need. So where are we now? Well, of the 5 implementation milestones, we've already had 2. We had the rules and guidance being issued in July last year, and the end of October deadline, which was when boards and equivalent management bodies were expected to have agreed implementation plans and be able to demonstrate that they've challenged and scrutinized them. And then the next interim milestone, which we've got at the end of that slide, is for manufacturers on the 30th of April this year, which is just 3 months away. And that's the date when manufacturers should have completed all the reviews that they need to do to meet the outcome rules for their own existing open products and services, so they can then share that information with distributors to meet their obligations under the duty and identify where any changes need to be made. And firms will then have until the end of July, which is just another 3 months, to meet the first key implementation deadline, you could say, for new and existing products or services that are open to sale or renewal. There's then a further 12 months before the final deadline strikes for closed products or services in July 2024. So since the previous session, what's happened is the FCA's found that some of the rules didn't quite or didn't fully give effect to the final policy that they'd intended. So they proposed some changes to the rules and guidance in a quarterly consultation to address those issues. And the consultation closed on the 9th of January. The main proposals are listed there on the slide, and essentially they relate to how the duty applies to firms only approving or communicating financial promotions, confirming that those financial promotion changes will also apply to firms in the temporary marketing permission regime. That's the regime for EEA fund managers selling funds into the UK post-Brexit. There's some changes for occupational pension schemes. The term retail customer, which is so central to all of this, needed to be adapted to address a possible misunderstanding that's specific to those types of structures. And the definition of closed product was something that was open to interpretation. It's supposed to be classed as closed if it's still being distributed. If it's not still being distributed, but it was open to interpretation that no product or service can be classed as closed if an account is still held or an ongoing relationship exists. And that wasn't the FCA's intention. It's supposed to include products or services with existing customers, but which are no longer open for sale or renewal. Next, there's a loophole that was identified for the exclusion for non-retail financial instruments. And if that exclusion applies, then firms in distribution chains don't need to consider whether they can determine or have a material influence over retail customer outcomes, as they're already outside of the scope of the duty. And what the FCA has said is the exclusion should only really be available to wholesale activities, and changes are now being made, but based on the consultation at least, to ensure that it isn't used by firms in a retail distribution chain. And then lastly, the FCA has already confirmed that the duty won't apply where there's an exclusion in particular sectoral source books, like MCOB or the Payment Services Regulations. And there was some uncertainty that the duty might only apply where sectoral source books include specific rules for an activity. In other words, if the source book is silent, then the activity wouldn't be covered at all by the duty. And again, that wasn't the FCA's intention. And beyond that quarterly consultation, what else has been going on is the FCA has been quite active in communicating what its expectations are through various other media, including website guidance. There was a series of sector-based webinars covering insurance right through to investments and banking and payments. And that recent podcast I mentioned too. So all of these releases are available on the FCA's website, and really are quite essential guides for anyone who's interested in implementation. And I think I'll hand you back over to Caroline.
Thanks, Jamie. So I am going to briefly cover some updates to Solvency II, which are actually really interesting. Anyway, back in November, Treasury published its consultation for proposals for a post-Brexit shift from the EU Solvency II regime. And these reforms aim to boost competition and innovation in the sector by reducing barriers to entry, by allowing more flexibility in the system and enabling new entrants to grow more quickly. So to facilitate this, on top of the other changes, the government has decided to increase the thresholds for the size and complexity of insurers before the new regime applies. And this is moving from 5 million to 15 million in annual gross written premiums, and from 25 million to 50 million in gross technical provisions. So firms below these thresholds will still be able to opt in should they wish to do so, but they will no longer be required to as part of the new solvency system. And so the government has stated that this new regime, which will be known as Solvency UK regime, will ensure that the system is tailored to financial services regulation in the UK, And it continues on the theme of sort of bolstering the competitiveness of the UK as a global financial centre. And but at the same time as doing this, they want to make sure that they maintain good outcomes and good consumer protection. I think through these changes as well, it's hoped that because of the changes in the Solvency II regime, I'm not going to go through them in detail, I'm just going to list them out briefly, but they're hoping that it will free up quite a fair bit of capital. And the ultimate hope from the government is that it will drive down policy prices for consumers. So to achieve this, the HM Treasury will, as you can see on the screen, they're going to reduce the risk margin by 65%, which is a huge number for long-term life insurance, and slightly less, it's a 30% reduction for general insurers. Again, they're saying that this is trying to help free up capital within Solvency II firms, but again, not to the detriment of policyholder protection. And through their studies, they think that those proportions do that. They're also going to incorporate notch ratings into the calculation of the fundamental spread. They'll increase investment flexibility by broadening the matching adjustment eligibility so that insurers can invest significantly more in long-term productive assets, especially in infrastructure. And finally, there will be a reduction in the reporting and administrative burdens on insurers, which they're going to streamline a number of the reporting requirements. I'm sure that's music to the ears of anyone to whom Solvency II regime applies. That's just briefly touching on that. I'm going to hand over to Chris now.
Okay, thanks, Caroline, and hello, everyone. Happy New Year. What we're going to touch on with this slide is twofold. Firstly, that the government publishing an illustrative statutory instrument on the new securitisation regulation is meant to be demonstrative of how the powers in the Financial Services and Markets Bill, which Caroline touched on earlier, will be used once enacted. The FSMB was, as Caroline said, introduced in July last year, and the purpose is that it will repeal retained EU law with UK law, such as SIs made by the Treasury and rules made by the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority. In the context of this slide, I think it's also worth noting that the bill creates a new designated activities regime, which allows the FCA to make rules that bind anyone, including those it doesn't authorise, who engage in financial markets activity. So the draft SI is intended to be paired with the revocation of the existing EU-derived securitisation rules, and also with forthcoming amendments to the rule books. It grants powers to the FCA and the PRA to make securitisation-related rules, including by making certain sell-side activities and securitisation designated activities. This means most of the day-to-day substantive rules applicable to market participants from the previously applicable retained EU law on securitisation will move to the rule books. It also gives directions to the FCA and PRA about how to regulate securitisation, including both firms and systematic financial stability considerations. And finally, it grants powers to the FCA to dispense with its rules in some circumstances, which looks like it's moving towards a sort of US-style no-action letter regime in this regard. And then secondly, what we want to highlight with this slide is that although the SI is not final policy and it's just illustrative, it does provide some insight to the potential direction of travel on securitized regulation. So, for example, the policy note accompanying the SI makes clear the FCA and the PRA should implement the securitization policy changes the Treasury identified in the December 2021 review. These include revising the disclosure requirements and in particular the public-private distinction in order to provide more flexibility for private deals, and reviewing risk retention arrangements to provide more flexibility, especially for CLOs and non-performing loan deals. And also reviewing the due diligence rules, especially as concerns to what information UK investors need in order to invest in non-UK deals. And finally, the SI makes clear that the regulatory perimeter will not change other than certain non-UK fund managers will be excluded. So if you move to the next slide, please.
Back to me. So building society reforms, as we've got on the slide, these are part of the Edinburgh reforms. And we're covering this topic because there are a few attendees from building societies, but I'm conscious that it is perhaps somewhat niche, so it's worth a bit of background before we get straight into the call for evidence. But as many of you will know, building societies are mutual societies, and what being mutual means is that most customers are also members of the building society and have certain ownership and voting rights that go with that. And there are particularities of being a building society that means rather than issuing a dividend, the surplus or profit of the society can be put back into the organisation for the benefit of the members through interest rates which are lower for borrowers and higher for savers. And to protect that mutual status, building societies have certain financial limits that don't apply to banks, being a lending limit and a funding limit. And we're focused on the funding limit here. And what that funding limit does is it requires at least 50% of the building society's funds to be raised in the form of shares held by individual members. So in other words, building societies can't raise more than 50% of funds from wholesale markets. And the funding limit is something that has been seen as restrictive, and it's something we've seen tested recently, at least in principle, by new and innovative service models like deposit aggregators, whereby building society deposit products can be offered at scale through third-party intermediaries like asset management platforms to their customers. But what that does is it gives rise to questions around how those new deposits are to be treated for the purposes of the funding limit. And as part of the Edinburgh reforms, the government is proposing to change the funding requirements. And it's going to do that by excluding certain sources of funding from the funding limit, which will make it easier to raise funds, particularly in times of financial stress, putting banks on an equal or a more equal footing with, building societies on a more equal footing with banks. So for example, deposits from SMEs, not just individuals, with a turnover of up to 6.5 million won't count towards the 50% funding limit. And it's also going to modernise the Building Societies Act, the 1986 Act, to make sure building societies are on or are given equal flexibility as for companies, such as to allow real-time virtual participation of members at general meetings. And I mentioned deposit aggregators. The Treasury is also reviewing and will revisit how funding obtained through intermediated saving platforms should be treated for the purposes of that funding limit. So we should hopefully have some more certainty in due course. On to the next topic.